in Ecclesiastes. We're gonna pick up in chapter 4, and we may get to a little bit of chapter 5 this morning. But we'll first off just recap a little bit about where we've come so far. So we've gotten through chapters 1, 2, and 3, and in the first chapter we kind of established that this is most likely Solomon writing this, and everybody kind of usually associates Solomon with wisdom and with his wealth and just being one of the kings of Israel. He also kind of experienced a lot of things that he shouldn't have and didn't follow God in all ways. So he dealt with a lot of the pains at the end of his life that were a result of him not being faithful to God. But there's several references there that point to it being Solomon. Then the writer starts to develop a couple thesis statements here. So the first one is that a lot that happens in life, a lot of the things that just distract us, are meaningless at the end of the day. Like, you could be distracted and taken away from God and be obsessed with work. You could be obsessed with wisdom and knowledge, or obsessed with wealth, or obsessed with the pursuit of pleasure. And he says these things are meaningless. Like, that's the net of the first chapter or so, is these are meaningless. And he's going to come back to this throughout. And the point is, without God and putting these things in front of God, it's just what he calls a chasing after the wind, which kind of, you ever try to chase after the wind, you're never going to really catch the wind, and you're not really going to be able to fly, even though that would just be fun to be able to run real fast and kind of be like a kite there. But like one of the other kind of statements, like, it sometimes comes across as pessimistic, but he says, like, this is all going to end with this life, and everybody's going to die at some point, and thus if you put all your pursuit into these things, not your pursuit into what Jesus would say is store up treasures in heaven, these are treasures that are going to perish. So they don't really have any lasting impact there. So when you think about it, and it sounds pessimistic, like, if you put it in an eternal context and say, like, if you put all your life into achieving a bunch here, it's not going to be here. That's the message there. So it's less a pessimistic thing and more of a raise up your head and kind of see more of a big picture context. Last week we talked a little bit about the different circumstances that we all share a place in time. It's not saying they're good, but like, these things are kind of a collection of things that, depending on how you look at it, it might be good, bad, it might be ugly. But like, there's a time and place for mourning, for happiness, for war, for peace. And he goes through all of these things there. And the point of this is, we should be content and satisfied in what God has blessed us with, and be content regardless of the circumstances. So sometimes people talk about joy, and having a godly joy is just regardless of sickness, if things are going well, if things are going poorly, having a godly kind of point of view, which is, hey, I'm blessed, and God's blessed me with a whole bunch of things there. So that's the first couple of chapters here, just in a real fast way. We're going to start today with chapter 4, and before we get into it, like, some of these things it's really difficult to read like the one chapter and get like the perspective of the whole book. It's even more difficult, I think, to read a couple verses, because you kind of are wondering, like, okay, where's this thing going here? So let's just read the whole thing in its context, and we'll just kind of break it apart. But if somebody can pick up and read Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 1 through 16.
Eyes are never satisfied. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. For he went from prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been more mourned for. I saw all the living who move about under the sun, along with that youth who was to stand in the king's place. There was no end of all people, all of whom he led. Yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this is also vanity and a striving act.
All right. Thanks, Catherine. What are some themes or topics that we kind of see in here? Kind of a few things going on here. Say again. Companionship. What else?
This is where we get the cord of three, which is sort of the smallest unit of community
Right.
and fellowship.
Yeah. And we'll talk about that a little bit. What else? Contentment. Say that again, Cliff. Striving. Yeah, I like that was my first one here. The harms of selfish ambition and the quest for more. So.
The hardness of life is there. There's other words into hardness.
Yeah, I agree. So there's a lot going on here. At first glance, you could almost look at it and say it's a bunch of random things strewn together. But like as we go through here, there's a lot of connection through the whole thing. Like the beginning of it and the end of it, like are totally related to each other, and just it kind of builds around. Like what I took as like the major themes were just the challenges and the harms that come from selfish ambition and just wanting more, and there could be harms for the others that are the oppressed, which is the first group he talks about, but there's also harms to the ambitious person that we talk about, like here, where he talks about loneliness and just not having anything there, and just there's a lot there. The importance of relationships, and then just satisfaction and contentment. So there's a lot here, and wow, like don't these things seem pretty relevant today? Like I feel like this is. Just growing up in America, I feel like this is the thing where kind of out of the gate, you're like, I want to strive. I want to go do things. But at the same time, like to too much. And you're like, well, for the sake of what? And am I abandoning Christ and abandoning God as I pursue more? And it's how do I just take the peace? He's going to talk about here, like one handful of quietness or one handful of tranquility. And as I was reading that, I was like, one handful is enough. Like just even having a handful is good. There's an observation he makes about the oppressed in the first couple verses. What does the king and wisest man in the world see in his observation? He sees a couple things. He sees oppression is rampant. He says here, all the oppressions that are done under the sun. So just on this earth, there's a lot of oppression. And we can kind of see that today, like we could see that as we read stories kind of back in history. There's no comforter for them. And then he has this point here where he says on the other side of the oppressor, no one was there to comfort them, and on the other side there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. So it kind of positions this as the powerful, or maybe taking advantage of the weak that are here. And this reads kind of interesting because here's the wisest person of his day, the wisest person ever here. Here's a powerful person, and he's having this moment of reflection of, like, in all this wisdom and with all this power, like this is how we're treated. This is how things are going. He doesn't describe it in a positive way, so he's not saying, "Look at this, we got all the power." So this is kind of reflective messaging that he has here. And he's achieved a lot. Like, think about what are some of the things that Solomon has done. I mean, he's late in his life. What are some things that he's known for? Built the tabernacle. What else? I mean, there's still infrastructure that he built that was used in Israel in the 60s. That's amazing, and still there. The massive tabernacle he built, it says in 1 Kings, it took 7 years to build that. And then he built a massive house for himself, and it says it took him 13 years to build that, which may be a statement on just kind of how he was positioning himself ahead of God already there. But some of the other things that he achieved, there were 20 years of peace. So if you remember his father, there was war and kind of all these things after. Now, this 20 years of peace, the result of some of these accomplishments, like what do you think would result? Sure, so how he may have achieved peace is marrying foreign women, and that kind of led it, like it may have sounded great at first, as like, let's have peace. But how you get there, like, are you trusting in God in doing that or doing something else? What else? What are some of the other things that might have resulted from like these accomplishments?
There's a lot of oppression from people that are supplying the materials to build these things. They were expected to produce more and more and more, but they weren't necessarily receiving the benefits of the household for Solomon. And we see that with Rehoboam when he's advised to give back to these individuals who are complaining and he doubles down and he wants to grow that stuff.
That's right. So there's oppression that's happening. There's people that are building and supporting all of this infrastructure, but they're not taking part in all of the mansion and all the goodness here. So it's an uneven kind of life, like the economy is uneven there as well. We read in 1 Kings also that some of the leaders that he had, like this one is one where you look at it and say, wow, it just tells you where they're going. But they conscripted some of their people to slavery. Now, like you think about Israel, like where'd they come from? Like Egypt. Like what did they see in Egypt? Slavery. Like they escaped slavery, they escaped all this stuff in Egypt. And Egypt, you could look at that too and say like, wow, some awesome buildings. And just how they got there, just slavery and just kind of, there was an unevenness there to that. So that tells you a little bit is that they've probably forgotten a little bit about who they were as they've gone through this. And also just the maintenance of the kingdom, just like you were saying, it took heavy taxation, and the taxation got worse. And the more things that they had, the more things that they built, the more they had to tax folks. And this is going to be the cause, like of the uprising when some of the kingdom up north breaks apart from the kingdom in the south, is they weren't kind of relieved of that tax and they were doubled down. And that's some of the poor wisdom that would come from a generation later after Solomon's gone. But just there, you can kind of see like there's some good here of what he's done, but just how he got there, not so great. Vicki?
God warned Israelite people about what it was going to be like when they had a king before they chose Saul. Because he said, you're going to be taxed, you're going to be conscripted, you're going to have to work for them, you'll never own anything. They said, look at this king. They rejected God in favor of a king, and the result is kings who become more and more powerful and more blessed.
That's right. If you didn't hear Vicki said God warned them about this when they didn't have a king and they were wanting a king, is that these are all the things that are going to happen with a king. Like they rejected God as their king and as their leader and wanted an earthly king. And earthly kings are imperfect, like humans are imperfect. So we see here like this oppression that he's talking about at the beginning, he's a major cause of the oppression. Which is one of those things where like he's reflecting on it now. So this ambitious agenda just resulted in this. Verse 2 kind of gives a hierarchy. So in verse 2 he comes down and he says, and I thought the dead who are already dead were more fortunate than the living who are still alive. If you read that alone, it's like, wow, this is super pessimistic. It's better to be dead than to be alive. But like, what's he saying here? Yeah, he's got this hierarchy that's there. So like at the top of the hierarchy, he comes down and he says, those that haven't been born yet. So if you haven't been born yet, it's kind of like ignorance is bliss. You don't really know of all of this evil that exists on earth. And there's evil. Like, there will be evil and there will be badness on earth until Christ returns and restores it and brings it to perfection. So while we're here, it is one of the greatest questions: why is evil allowed to kind of succeed and to look like it gets ahead? And again, here we just have to have the big picture mindset of, we know God's judgment's coming, and at some point he's already won the war. He just hasn't pushed the final kind of button on this one. But we know in the end that perfection is kind of what's on the horizon for us. His second level, so he says, starts with like those who haven't been born, they don't know anything yet. Then you got the dead. The dead, they don't have to experience this any longer, so they've kind of been saved here. It's kind of a reminder to when you think about in Paul, when Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 5:8, would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So while you could look at it and say, wow, it's better to be dead. Well, yeah, like we all know, like if we're absent here, we're present with the Lord. So while it may sound depressing, it's more of a, like, this is Solomon speaking, and he doesn't even have that knowledge, but there's biblical truth in that. And then the last ones here, he said, at the bottom of the hierarchy is those that are still living, and they're constantly reminded of all that's wrong in the fallen world. So they just kind of got to experience it. And while on the surface it seems kind of depressing, kind of a biblical truth that you just see, like, that's what we go through. That's that like in life we go through a bunch because of the fallen world. Any thoughts there or questions before we get to the next section here?
That goes throughout all of this. And if you think of, a lot of people don't believe so. And it really doesn't make sense. And the two is the Lord. Not everything is great. You look at things in the world. Slavery, you see, all the way back to the very beginning of this. Slavery. Oppression.
Yeah, the only time we didn't have oppression is in the garden before the serpent. So, and Revelation gives us an awesome picture, because at the end, there's no more of any of this. No, like Revelation, they go through no more tears, no more, like all this bad that we see here, there's no more of that in heaven. So we've got to deal with it a little longer. Kind of like seasons we go through in life. Right now, it's oppressive heat. I know Caleb doesn't love it. I love it. But it's going to be winter sometime soon, and then Caleb's going to be bragging to me and wearing his kind of toboggan hat, and I'm going to be like, so I don't know. I hope they get the seasons, like you get to push your button, like for whatever custom season you want in heaven. Yeah, I mean, yeah, like the thermostat, like environmental thermostat. I'll come visit you, Caleb. Exactly. Yeah.
All forever.
So skipping down to verse 4. In verse 4 he says, "Then I saw that all the toil and all the skill in the world come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This is also a vanity." Wow. Does this sound, do we see this today? Yeah, we're going to talk about that. So he says where labor and achievement come from is, it's the age-old problem. It goes back to Cain and Abel. Envy, Jacob and Esau. You can go look at the Jewish leaders and Jesus, like they were jealous of his rising influence and wanted to reject him. And even just looking at the Ten Commandments, one of the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not covet. So this one's an age-old problem. From 1913 to 1940, there was a popular comic strip in newspapers. You remember the newspaper comic strips? Like those are the best back in the day. But there's a family that's depicted in this comic book. It's the McGinnis family. And they're climbing the social ladder. So like it's a very American thing of like, oh, the McGinnis family. And they were often shown discussing what their neighborhood family next to them was doing. The neighborhood family was going to the movies, they were buying something new, and they were struggling a little bit, trying to keep like advancing to that next level. And they'd say, look at what this person has, look at what they have. And you'd see the husband come in like the next pane. He said, I'll ask my boss for a raise, and so I can get an allowance there. And throughout the comic strips run, you know who you never see? Never see the neighbor. You don't see the neighbor through the whole thing. It's kind of like the guy on the other side of the fence in Home Improvement. But you know what the last name of the neighbor family is? It's Joneses. This is where we get the whole saying, like, keeping up with the Joneses is a comic strip. But this comic strip, it was popular for a long time, and we still refer to this thing today, keeping up with the Joneses here. But just as you think about it, like this constant want for, look at what they have. Let's go we got to get that thing. I got to get a boat. I got to get this thing here. And Solomon's got this observation. Solomon's built a lot. And maybe he was trying to keep up with the Joneses of his day. Maybe he looked at the pyramids in Egypt and said, I got to one-up them. I got to get something about them. But what he says there is this is just a chasing after the wind. So it's not bad in itself to go do things, but like just what he's getting to is like, well, what's driving us when we do those things? And a lot of times it's more selfish motivations. Let's see. He gets to this next point here. If we were worried a little bit about like the message of Ecclesiastes being chill out, don't do any work, just kind of be lazy, like he hits that one kind of head on here. Verse 5, yours said the fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh, Catherine. What do some other folks have here? Say that again. Some people have ruined themselves. It kind of reads a little odd, like eats his own flesh. But like in looking at this one, how he's describing it, he's juxtaposing here this lazy person. And he's saying the fool folds his hands, so his hands are folded, he can't really he's not doing anything. He's just kind of being lazy, just chilling. So like that's the picture he's got, is the fool has got his hands folded and doing nothing. This is the exact opposite of toil and work there. And then he says in some places eats his own flesh, in some places ruins himself. And the point he says here is, and this is his kind of connection point, is the fool that is lazy starves to death, or starves. Because the lazy person is like if you look at it like physically, Carrie, I don't know if this is what really happens, but like your body's going to consume itself over time. Like it has to have some way of getting energy to kind of have your heart beat and all your body function. So your body's going to consume itself. It'll start with like fat and some of the other things, and then it'll start into the muscle and then just kind of continue on. But like it's a kind of gross way of seeing like what happens with starvation. But like on the literal front, he eats his own flesh. The other side of it is just that you could say he's just starving overall here. But so we don't get this picture of the fool. The fool and laziness is something that's better than kind of working and striving. You kind of start to get like the bookends of doing all this stuff out of envy, chasing after things, striving for more. That's not good. Being lazy, that's not good. There's a balance. Here. Verse 6. He's got better is a handful of quietness than 2 handfuls of toil and striving after the wind. What's he saying? Okay. That's yeah. So you got a handful. What else? Other thoughts there? So got sometimes be quiet.
Going back to chapter 2 where we have sort of there's a time for this and a time for this and a time for this and a time for this, those beautiful dichotomies that we read. Same concept here, there is a time for stillness and there's a time for work.
Yeah, and I think
quiet is a little, you have to sort of, what does that mean? What does quiet mean there?
Yeah, and I think we get exactly that point. God established a day of rest. Like just you get it from the very beginning there. When I read this, like you've got 2 comparison points here. You got like he's really talking about the more part here. He's like better, like just you had a handful and not 2 handfuls. and being content with things, like, and he had peace. And you think about that, like, and he's really making a message here about like that chasing after the two handfuls. And what happens then? You chase after the two handfuls and you're like, maybe I got to work a little harder. Maybe that day of rest is like gone. Maybe the kids, I miss seeing them do something, or maybe I got home late, or maybe I'm not getting any rest for like at night and I'm working extra hours there. And he's saying like, better is being content and having one handful than all the stuff that comes with chasing to go get that second handful there. And again, like some people have 2 handfuls, some people have 10 handfuls. This is not saying like you're bad because you got them, but like when you compare kind of what he's talking about here, he said this person with 1 handful that was content, they've got peace. They've got, I love tranquility as a word there. They've got that. And the person who's chasing after this, they've got all the worry that comes with that. In the U.S. today, like you read stories about our debt levels in the country. Like for the country, like there's the debt levels there, but like consumer debt, like you read after it and you're like, that whole chasing after or trying to keep up with the Joneses thing, that makes an entire business of just debt that's out there, and people get themselves in trouble and they're like, oh shoot, this person just got a car. And you think about all the struggle that people go through. One of the top causes of like mental illness and just kind of stress is money. It's people chasing after this. So when Solomon's known about this, Solomon didn't need to see our debt levels today to tell, like, look, you kind of go chase after more than you need and not be content. And you're going to have a lot of stresses in your life there. Yeah, and Vicky's saying, like, Paul knew this. Paul, like, shipwrecked in prison, and he knew that, like, there's a contentment in God and having the perspective there. Let's turn to 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 6 through 8, because Paul talks about this topic a lot. Chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. Sure. Yeah.
But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we received nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that.
If we could all just listen to that, like, and say that a lot, like, we got food, we got our needs met. Like, maybe not all of our wants are met, but like our needs met here overall, and learning to live with just contentment. There. And again, it's not laziness. He talks about laziness here. So like if like contentment's kind of right in the middle there of you got work. You're like in the last chapter. So he says like be content with the work that he's given us to do. So like there's stuff to do on this side of heaven, and be content with that as well. Like this next observation he gets to is about relationships. And this is relationships, but it's connected into this whole kind of selfish ambition and this striving point that he's been talking about all along here. He says here, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their toil. And then if one falls, the other will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. And again, if 2 lie together, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him, and a 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. So he's kind of got this math that he's established here. I was reading a kind of summary of a survey that was done a few years ago, and it was talking about like surveying the happiness levels of people based on their income levels across time. And he said that those with higher incomes spent more time alone and less time with family and friends than others. And just the point, and then he found at the other end of it as well, like those with very, very little spent less time with their family and friends there. And again, this study, you kind of got to get this picture of there's a balance here.
Go to a third world country on a mission trip and it will blow your mind.
Yeah.
And they have nothing, and they just love each other, and that's all that matters. That's literally
Contentment.
the only thing that is. And so,
So orphanage that we went to in Mexico was a room half the size of the sanctuary, filled with about 15 kids. Literally nothing was in the room except for a sofa, and a table to eat off of. Not a television, not a video game, not an Xbox. And what they played was Duck Duck Goose and Freeze Tag, and they were the joy,
yes.
the smiles, the laughter in that room was so energizing. It was so incredible. That was one of the impressions that was made upon me when we left. They had nothing. And here we are as Americans, we have everything, and we're still not nearly as content as they are.
Yeah, it's kind of it's a fault. Like what we would think of as everything is just a false hope at the end of the day. Solomon's observation here, he said like this person who's striving, they have no family, and they are continuing to toil to no end, and they never have enough. But he's lonely and he has no one to enjoy the fruits of his labor. That's this picture that we get here. And maybe there's some folks that are chasing after whatever it ends up being, and they don't have this, but he's making a broad generalization here about something he's observed. And we can see this. Like there's a bunch of Christmas classic stories where we kind of see this every year as well. Like when I was reading this, I was thinking of Ebenezer Scrooge, and you kind of go through his whole life kind of in that book, The Christmas Carol. If you watch the movie, you kind of see like he's chased after everything, and he kind of lost his friend, and he's got nobody. But he starts off like when he goes to Christmas Past, he starts off, man, he was good. He was good, like, and maybe his poverty is what drives him to want more and more and more. But we see that kind of like when you put a biblical perspective on it, his whole life of chasing after more and not being poor was chasing after the wind. And you kind of also see it a little bit in the George Bailey story in It's a Wonderful Life. At the end of that one, he kind of sees like what he had spent his life doing, like his friends, his family. That's really where his richness was. And I like at the end of that movie when Clarence the Angel. Hopefully, this is not a spoiler alert for anybody. I mean, it can't be a spoiler alert. This is like I watch this movie every Christmas Eve anyway. But the Clarence the Angel gets his wings and he says, "Remember, no man is a failure who has friends." And you kind of get this picture here of like the two Christmas story characters, but like that very much rhyme with what we're seeing here is like the person who's chasing after this stuff to the detriment of relationships. They're really poor at the end of the day. They have not a lot. The friends math that he's got here is 2 is better than 1, and he kind of goes through it and he says there's better returns because you got more people to do stuff together. And I see this at work all the time. Like you got a team, and the more people you have on your team that are working towards a common goal, the more stuff you get done. And if you get a whole bunch of different groups together organized on the same vision, you can get a lot done. When we came together as Liberty Christian and Pole Green Church, we said like the whole thing that we talked about was better together. And man, this has been better together, and God's blessed us in a number of ways here.
I just think the priorities, talking about the children in Mexico and the foreign countries too. I think the Adam TV, the real wise people will tell you, you can't have a child unless you have $200,000. It's like, you can't have a child unless you humongous amount of money. And you go to these foreign countries and there's kids everywhere, and they are them, and they look at them as being valuable, and they don't know anything. I mean, really, they got nothing to do. But the priority.
Yeah, their wants are probably less at the end of the day to be able to get content with that. The other points that you have here, if you've got 2, you've got somebody there to help you out. If you're unable, like you fall down, you got somebody that can help you here. You got somebody that can provide warmth. Like you could look at this like physically, like and literally, like if you're traveling and you get cold and you have to just sleep on the ground at night, you got somebody to sleep next to. Or figuratively, it's a cold world that we live in, and if you got somebody there to provide warmth here. And the last thing he talks about here in this kind of 2 is better than 1 is you can defend yourself better if you got 2. So you're by yourself, it's going to be kind of hard, and you can be easily overtaken, but 2 is better than 1 there. And then he's got, but 3 is better than 2. And he's got this threefold cord that's not quickly broken here. Sometimes you hear this third strand is God or Christ here, and that's definitely a cool one. Maybe that's what the writer's intending here. But like another explanation could just be like having another friend or having community here is better than just kind of better than 2. So just like friendships, relationships, these things are all kind of better than loneliness. And we live in a time where people have a lot, but like are seemingly becoming more and more lonely, just even though there's a lot out that we have here. So relationships is this next theme that he's been kind of focused on. Any thoughts before we move on to this kind of last point here that he's got in chapter 4?
Bible study I'm hearing is about boundaries and like renewing of your mind and how to travel through that. And one of the big pieces of it is holding everything that you have with good hands. And that's kind of like what I see here a lot in this connection here is like, you know, we can still have goals and want to achieve things in our work life or, you know, in other avenues, but we should still hold them with open hands and allow those things to be given back to God.
Yeah, I like that. What else? Other thoughts?
You know, in the current world, the whole verse here about the man's envy of his neighbor, you think about social media and how it has warped our covetousness to such an extreme, comparing, seeing everybody else's false lives and thinking that your life is miserable, blah, blah, blah. And then you cut down to where we were just talking about just the contentment in community, even with social media, how community itself has been warped and twisted. Relationships have been warped and twisted. It's how many friends you have, how many followers you have. You don't know those people. You don't dine with those people. You don't eat with those people. So those people don't know your heart, don't know your life, don't do life with you. So in this day and age, these are powerful, powerful verses when you think about what they really, truly mean in the context of flesh and blood and not machine that we've all been hooked to by an IV drip, you know, like, and it's terrifying, but it's also an incredible lesson in unplug and love human beings.
Yeah, if you read this the first time and you just think, wow, there's a bunch of like random points that he's firing off here. Like it's all connected in here. Because like you look at it and you say, like what drives a lot of this? Envy. You like, I mean, if it's on social media, you might look at it and say, well, so-and-so's got 1,000 friends. Let me go get like, but they're shallow. They're not real relationships. Or if somebody's got like some new car and they got a boat and they got something else and you're like, I need to go get that. So you're working hard and then you do all that stuff and you get to the end of it and you're like, I got a car, I got a boat, I got no friends to do anything with. And I got nothing. So you're like, you get to the end of that, you're like, it was all for nothing. Like I don't have anybody to enjoy this with. So a lot of the, like you just look at them and they're just like, they build upon each other. Like this chasing after this dream or chasing after this thing causes all these consequences down the road that the first person, like the first step, it doesn't sound bad, but like the second, third step, fourth step, and all these steps, like where are they going? They're going away from God and they're following after this thing here that they're chasing after. Other thoughts before we kind of get to this last kind of section here is going to kind of bring it together with like a little story here. But if you look through the New Testament, like just just do a search on selfish ambition or envy, you will just see like so many kind of places here. Throw contentment in there. James talks about this a lot. In James 3:16, he talks about disorder, and every vile practice follows these things. Galatians 5:20, Paul talks about envy as one of the fruits of the flesh, one of these like bad fruits that's out there. So you kind of look through the New Testament, and then you juxtapose this with what does Jesus talk about in the Sermon on the Mount? He talks about storing up treasures in heaven. And we can do that, storing up treasures in heaven, relationships, like people that we bring to Christ with us. Like that's what it's all about. This last section here, I'll reread it here, is it's kind of a tragic tale, and it kind of brings together the whole picture here. But in verse 13, just starting here, he says, "Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. For he went from prison to the throne through his own, though in his own kingdom he had been born poor. I saw all the living who move under the sun, along with that youth who was to stand in the king's place. There was no end to all the people, all whom he led. Yet those who would come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is a vanity and a striving after the wind." So this story here starts with, he states, better is this poor young guy who is kind of low on the totem pole than the wise old king who's arrogant and won't listen to advice here. He said this poor young guy is better. This kind of reminded me as I was kind of running through this thing, like you ever hear people say, I wish I knew then what I know now. Like all the things you experience. I know when my oldest two graduated college, I kept telling myself, like I was thinking, what would I tell my 20-something-year-old self after working in corporate America? What would I tell him to go do? And then just start giving my kids advice, because they are my 20-something-year-old self. And I can say, like, hey, I did like that. Hey, don't do that. Like, and I think there's a lot in this one about like chasing after stuff where it's like, hey. Yeah, because yeah, and he knows his future because it's been told to him here. But you got this reflection forward here, and when he says better wise and poor youth than a foolish king, the foolish king sounds like he's so prideful that he's unable to take advice here, and this poor person that's coming from nothing, he didn't have much, but he did have wisdom. But then the way that this story works, he says, better was a poor and wise youth. He's going to come from nothing, and he's going to become the king in this story. So this poor person came from nothing, and he becomes the king, and he becomes popular. So kind of goes from nothing to something here. And you can imagine along the way this story of like all the striving he did to kind of fight his way through there. Maybe think about like Joseph going from nothing in prison to something, where he was the second highest person in Egypt at the time. But this poor person goes from nothing to something. He's popular. It says it had no end to all the people that he had following him. But then the generation after that is going to come, and you see that this popularity and this power is fleeting. He said that those that come after him were not pleased. And then so in the end, even though this poor person fought from like the bottom and kind of made it to the very top, it was all just a chasing after the wind, like all this striving. And again, it doesn't make the like anybody's kind of pursuit of success, like different things that people, it's not calling a person bad because they've been successful at something or lifted themselves up. But you can kind of see this story here of the dangers is all that thing that you think you're chasing after, it's without hope. Like kind of like Gina was saying earlier, we got all these things and we think we got everything. We don't really have everything. Like all the things that we think are everything that we have, they're not there. They're meaningless in the end. And just like Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, when he's talking about treasures in heaven, all the treasures that we have, all these earthly treasures, they're going to perish. They're going to burn up. They're going to be gone. They can be stolen. So they're meaningless in the end. And that's the story that you get here, where it kind of brings it all together. And how it brings it all together is you get this picture of this person. He says, like, he's poor and he's wise. So he's coming from nothing. Maybe he's in prison. And if you go back to the very beginning of this thing, you think of that oppressed person that's there. Like, and the other side of the oppression is the power. And you got this poor person who's probably being oppressed, and probably starts off with this great dream of, I'm gonna be king one day, and I'm gonna make it better for folks. But like in the end, like even his kind of striving for that great power, it's just a fleeting distraction, and almost you kind of see the point of like just the slippery slope of striving after more things versus contentment.
One of the things that is popular in Scandinavia, and I'm kind of doing it, but I'll challenge each of you, is to go home and look around your house today. What in your house that you have today, especially those that have children, will go to the next generation? Because, I've been asking my kids, do you want this, do you want this, do you want this? Most of the time it's no, 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 no. And I've been talking to a friend who's done the same thing. Do you want this? Or when I die, are you going to throw it away or are you going to take it? And the child will say, I'm going to throw it away. So what are we saving for if we don't store up those treasures in heaven? Very much like what Solomon is doing here. He can pass on his wisdom. But what he has, it's going away. What is his son going to respect? I think it's very little.
Yeah, and even his son, like this, like part where Chip was saying, like maybe he's seeing his next generation here a bit. His son's not going to listen to wise counsel and make a bunch of kind of bad moves. You talking about like the treasures we think we have in our attic and the treasures we have in our house and surround ourselves. My in-laws are starting to downsize and planning to kind of move to something smaller, and they've got like a group chat where they're like sending out to the kids and grandkids, do you want this? And people are like tagging in that they want stuff. There's a long list of stuff that nobody wants in there, and that's going in an estate sale pile and stuff like that. And I was telling my father-in-law last night, I was like, I told Jesse the other day, we just need to go through in the fall and just thin out our attic, because there's so much stuff that we think it's something, but it's nothing. Nobody's going to want it. There's this last story here. Go ahead, Caleb.
I don't know if this is right or not, but I've read verses 13 through 16 about the 10 times just sitting here. And I'm wondering, is Solomon almost writing a little bit of an autobiography? Is he writing this about himself? And so, sure, he was David's son, so he wasn't born. But born as the king's son, was he like in the shadow of his dad? Was that the prison? I don't know. Maybe I'm putting more metaphor in here than there actually is. But is this even a story of him saying, like, look, I was born in this kingdom that I now lead, and as the king, I'm that old foolish king who can't be abolished anymore. Like, being a king is I get a sense.
Yeah,
There is an I in this.
Yeah.
There absolutely is an I.
Yeah.
This is autobiographical.
I think you can look at this as multi-generational autobiographical, because like if you connect all of it, if you see, because like, and I think you see his son Rehoboam in here as well, like because you start with David's like the coming from nothing, like he wasn't the king, and he rises to the king. So like you start with David's the nothing. He wasn't in prison, but he's just coming from poverty in the kingdom, rises to the king. You've got Solomon, who kind of is this next little arc underneath that kind of continues the kingdom advancement. And then you got Rehoboam, like, and like even in his kingdom advancement, like we talked earlier about like all the things that like he made a bunch of compromises. He married foreign women. He was distracted from following God and followed other gods. He kind of did all the things that you wouldn't think a Jew would do. There, so he wasn't listening to wise advice, and then his son will come along and listen to the worst advice, and that'll be the kind of nail in the coffin for the kingdom of Israel, and it'll be divided when they try to overtax people. So you look at it like this is multi-generational autobiographical would be how I would think about it.
I can't think of another book that puts it so clearly and give the conclusion of this matter. I can't think of another book that ends that.
Yeah, this is definitely an interesting book, and I think there's just a number of places that it connects into. There's a story I was reading about the other day. It was the Dallas Cowboys, which I don't know if we have any Dallas Cowboys fans in here. Anybody? Ike's back there still. So, but the story I read, and you could fact check me, Ike. Tell me if I got any of this stuff wrong. But this is the Tom Landry, who was their first coach, I think, and he coached the team after winning their first Super Bowl. So it took him 12 years for him to get his team to win the Super Bowl. And you can imagine, like, if you're the coach of that team or the players on that team, it's the best thing ever, right? Super Bowl, you get to go to Disney World after. But like, so, and you got to imagine for him, like, he'd been coaching for 12 years. People might have been sitting there going, not good enough along the way. Maybe he hears a bunch of stuff talking to him, and he's just chasing after this Super Bowl win. And he mentions after this thing, he said, the overwhelming emotion of it all in a few days among the players was how empty that goal was. There must be something more. That's what he said. Like, the overwhelming emotion in a few days among all the players is going to be just an empty goal. There's something more than this. So you kind of look at it and say, like, even all these things that we have here, they're just not, they're not it. Like, they're fun accomplishments, but they all cease. Can't take it with you, and it has no lasting impact along the way here. But what he says at the end, there must be something more, that would just be a good summary. Like, we are chasing after more and more and more, and there is something more. The something more is God. That we don't need more stuff, we need more God. And there must be something more. It would be a good summary for this chapter here. Let's see, 10:30. We can probably start chapter 5 and just read the first couple kind of sections here, and then we'll just put a wrap in for today and then pick up next week. Any more thoughts before we pick up and kind of read the first few verses of chapter 5?
I think there is something more, and obviously there is, but the notice that I'm seeing is the difference between Old Testament writing and New Testament writing is New Testament writing really focuses on what that something more is, where, because Christ hasn't come yet in the Old Testament, this really is very pessimistic. It's very kind of like, woe's me.
It's like walking, like, what's the point of life?
It feels very hopeless, but you know, if I need to go to that Crowder song, all my hope is in Jesus, you hear that in the New Testament. When you were talking about relationships, it's very clear all throughout the Old Testament, God's template for us. It's all the design was based upon relationships. We are designed to have relationships with one another. It's sin that separates us from Christ. It's also sin that separates us from one another. So that sounds very sad and very downtrodden, but where is the hope in that? And he offers it in like 3 little sentences at the end of the chapter, which is kind of sad, but you see so much hope in the New Testament.
Yeah, and we got the whole book. Like, we've seen the whole thing opened up for us. To me, I think it is sad, but it's true. And it gives you this, like, doorway, or this kind of, wouldn't you want to know what somebody's thinking? Like, if we're told to go out into the world and to take this message to the world, like, you kind of know, like, well, like, what's going to connect with this person? But this kind of gives you, like, this is life for a lot of people. All their hope is in this stuff here. And all the realness, like, just think about Solomon. He's reflecting on this. He's kind of far away from God in his life. He's lived far away from God, but he's thinking these things and writing them down. Think about that person who's never put God in their life, hasn't come to Christ, is living life chasing after all of this. They're thinking it. And we got this book here that tells us, like, this is the mindset. Like, we always think of the mindset, maybe we look at them as enemies and may look at them as, they're never going to listen to this thing. But, like, they might just be looking at it as, like, I just want more. Like, there's something more. And we got to maybe shift some of that mindset to say, like, look at the mindset here. This is the mindset, is like, just at some point, everybody's going to conclude the same thing. All this stuff we chase after here, it's not it.
I just think this, to me, this is the book of reality and the way things are. And I think that promise after the flood, that God gives the promise, and says, as long as the earth remains, it will sow and we spring and we harvest. And it's like, you don't like the hot, or somebody else doesn't like the cold, but it's the way it is until God gives us that new world, that new, incredible world.
Yeah. So for us, it's real. But it's real. It's kind of where that mindset is, and this may be a call for us to say, like, if this is the destiny and the eternity for people that don't have it, this is all they have, and it's only this time. Like, just we want to win more of them and store up more treasures in heaven. All right. I'm not going to start now because this is we got like 10:35, so I'm just going to call it wraps here. We'll pick up on chapter 5 next week. Any other thoughts before we wrap up here? Awesome. Well, thanks for all the discussion points. Let's pray.